Hi, good morning. My name is Ely Wick, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about this podcast. Kind of a synopsis, if you will, an introduction. What I'd like for you to gain from listening, the inspiration for it, and also to introduce myself. I'm an artist, an avid, borderline obsessive book lover all my life, a professional tattoo artist for the past 17 years, and books have always been my biggest inspiration in my life as an artist, ever since I first picked up a book and first laid pencil to paper. I've wanted to create a book club for years, but those of you that have tried this know of the hardships involved, the complexities of people, time, and schedules. So this is my contribution to the book community, to give back to the books that have changed my life. Forevermore, the book club, a podcast book club for those that have always shared the same dream and want to share their experiences in the world of beautiful books. So I want to tell you a little bit more about what to expect from this podcast. I really want to introduce you to this book. I want you to fall in love with it like I did. It's kind of me introducing you to the book like an old friend. I'll go over kind of a summary to the characters and their personal profiles, insights into their journeys, events, a little bit about the author, maybe about movie adaptations, or its impact on everyday life. And we'll talk about book recommendations and the art inspired by it. So in this podcast, we'll kind of mourn and grieve. These episodes are devoted to the aftermath of finishing a really good book, to the world built by an incredible author, the characters we fell in love with, the thoughts, shared moments, even tears, and to ask questions we might have. So grab some coffee or maybe tea and get comfortable. These are the raw, unfiltered epithets of the books we love as readers. And I'd so love to share with you this amazing, incredible book I just read. It's by Stephen King, published in 1968. It's 1,153 pages of pure, magical, horror-induced fiction, and it's absolutely brilliant and beautiful in every single way imaginable, in a absolutely horrifying kind of way. I think you might really love it, maybe even be inspired to dive into this journey with me, or pick it up, or create something really beautiful. And it's totally okay if not, for there's no pressure in the world of books. Kind of a brief synopsis. It takes place in the quiet and quaint town of Derry, Maine, around the late 50s up to the mid 80s. And in this town, in the sewer, lies this horrible truth, kind of a monster, a thing of nightmares, your inner worst fears imagined. Children are disappearing, bodies found. It's a mess, and no one's talking about it. Adults almost seem to turn their heads the other way. So a group of friends calling themselves the Loser Club decide to solve this quandary and face this darkness, all while finagling their way around a gang of bullies in life as adolescents. And they face their fears head on, you know. Later on, as adults, they actually come back after forgetting everything until it all comes back. And they face those same fears as adults. This story is it's more or less about the struggle of childhood into adulthood, adolescence, friendship, love, fear, overcoming that fear, and the courage it takes, how we as adults sometimes forget, but are doomed to repeat it, even becoming the monsters we feared as children, until we can face it head on and be able to truly move on with our lives. It's about fear and overcoming it, the hardships of the things we carry over with us as adults from childhood and the trauma associated with it. Kind of a bit of an advisory warning. I think that's kind of important. First and foremost, there will be spoilers that might not be for you, and that's okay. Even this first half to kind of get you interested in it would be really good. Secondly, I am a fan of adult language. I don't mean it in a offensive or aggressive kind of way. More or less just a little sprinkle of flavoring, you know. But I wanted to let you know, that way you're not in, like, you know, balls deep into it and you're like, I'm so offended. That's not my intention. Also, I'm not a licensed psychologist. This is all purely based off of my perspective and experience with these characters and this author. And I'll kind of go over some psychological profiles because I find that very interesting. And also, there will be adult language, abuse, sexual abuse, racism, homophobia. There's animal cruelty, severe mental illness, and all of the things. Books are meant to open up a good conversation about really hard topics. And this journey is meant to be a raw outlook on books. And I feel like they really are meant to leave a reader with more questions than answers. They're meant to provoke a good conversation. And don't even get me started on the concept of banned books. That's for a whole another episode. But I just want to kind of prepare you emotionally for subjects that can be really sensitive. But I think it's important to be able to talk about those things so that we can learn from them and learn how to understand it and help and figure it out. You know, a lot of people want to kind of ignore these things. But it's important. I think it's good for society to talk about it so that we can learn how to help people that are struggling with these things. A little bit of an introduction. I've actually read this book a long time ago after seeing the first movie. And funny enough, I actually first saw it around the age of 11 or 12. And then recently, I heard that the new movies were more like the book. And I was intrigued. They got me. You know what I mean? So, like a good reader would, I reread the book as an adult. Absolutely fucking loved it. I carried it with me everywhere I went. It was like carrying around a baby, as I'm a fan of paperbacks. And this little man is, 153 pages of magic, a pure, beautiful, healthy, just magic. And I took him with me to the dentist. I took him with me to work. I spent late nights up with him trying to find just the right position. At some point I dropped him in the tub. I would be an awful, awful mother. I'm just saying. So I finished it, and then I felt this void in my life of losing all my new friends. I watched the movies. I yelled at the TV. I frightened my dog. I mourned the book, and then obsessively researched it. When watching interviews with the author, seeking to answer all the questions I could possibly have had, and then decided to start a podcast after realizing how many others might have gone through this very moment. Ridiculous. Overall, I might be able to say I have thoroughly grieved in this process. Maybe. But I will forever think about this book. It's so fucking good. And I was so sad to finish it. I was so sad, in fact, I left the last few pages unread for a week while trying to figure out how to write and talk about this book to share with others. How to convey how life-changing this book really was, both as a child and as an adult. Even while writing this, I have the book with me, complete with water stains and tears from that first spine crack of a new book to the crazed notes made in the margins. It taught me about fear and forgetting and how trauma lies within memory. One of my favorite things that makes this book so unique is how it can help and relate so strongly to someone as a child, just as much as it can to an adult. And how Stephen King was able to marry the adult perspective with their child counterpart and capture that character's thoughts and feelings and growth throughout. It's a really genuinely raw outlook on fear that we as people would prefer to ignore, even forget. It's so much like how the adults in the story would turn the other way, unable to see the horrid realities of this world and how we contribute to the problem. I will say the Stephen King universe is my comfort world. I love it. I love existing in it. And it's actually one of the reasons why I later realized why I bought a cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, is because I have been living that life for decades in his books. A little bit of a backstory to kind of set up the setting of it. It takes place in Derry, Maine, from about the mid-50s to mid-80s. So it kind of combines the childhood with adults, and they kind of cross over. But the childhood takes place around 1957, 58 to about 1984, 85. They were a victim of their time and the realities that contribute to it. So they were facing a lot of racism, homophobia, and severe mental illness that was left untreated. Bullying to the extent of extreme violence, even death. It really does offer the detrimental idea of bullying and suicide caused by bullying. Currently, that has been kind of recent subjects as of late. And I think this book is actually really insightful way to look at it from a child's perspective that's going through it. I think sometimes adults turn the other way. You know, adults just have different worries than children do. But I think this book will offer a lot of insight and a new perspective on it. I'm going to go over more of the main premise. Basic cliff notes. Beginning, middle, and end. I'm going to miss some things, but again, reading the book, you get to savor it. You get to love it, especially Stephen King's books. But I want to kind of I want to paint a picture for you over this book. I'm going to kind of jump into it. I'm going to miss some key points, but I'm going to later hit that when I get into character profiles and psychological perspectives later in the podcast. But it all starts with the death of Bill Dunbroe's little brother, Georgie, in the fall of 1957. After floating a boat his brother made for him while he was sick in bed on a rainy day, followed by the disappearance of several children and brutal murders, and mysteriously nightmarish visions of a clown surrounding these murders and the sewers beneath. Bill and his group of friends kind of serendipitously meet each other over the summer of 1958. They start calling themselves the Loser Club after run-ins with the local group of bullies led by Henry Bowers. And they realize they all share very similar experiences with this clown and horrifying experiences relating to their worst fears. And they find out more about Derry's history and this fucking clown that's running around. And mind you, adults don't see any of this. You know, there's a scene where the sink explodes with blood, so the adults don't see the blood, they don't see the clown, they don't see the balloons. It really is kind of based off of, this monster kind of feeds off of imagination. So a couple of things happen, you know. Georgie's photo in his album winks at Bill. There's a dam built that floods out the barrens in Derry, but that was actually where they met Ben after Ben was running away from Henry Bowers and his gang, and they carved Henry's name into Ben's stomach. It was fucking awful. There was another photo moment in Bill's room with Richie where Bill cuts his finger, but Richie pulled his hand out of the album. There's a rock fight between the two rivals. There's another photo moment of the old town in Derry, and in this plastic film album, because Mike's dad is brilliant and he really wants to teach his little boy about the history of Derry. And something about the clown's smushed face in this album. And oh man, the book does such a good job capturing moments like that. So they end up building an underground clubhouse, and all throughout it's kind of spotted with these horrifying Pennywise sightings for each member. So the main antagonist, well, Henry, kind of a secondary antagonist, I guess, he really starts genuinely losing it. He actually really starts meaning to kill them versus threatening, which is, it's intriguing. You can kind of see him deteriorating mentally throughout the book. After several run-ins, Beverly actually runs into them at the dump. There's this weird boy fart game, and then this penis thing happens between Henry and Patrick, and then it's followed up by Patrick's refrigerator of torture and Patrick's little hobby with animal cruelty, and then his death by flying leeches. and I'm laughing because we're gonna go more over like his mental state later on. I think now child psychologists would have picked up on a lot of their tendencies now than before. But Henry and his gang ends up breaking Eddie's arm. And Henry he's such a bugger. He's such a bugger, but bear in mind he's coming from an abusive household. He comes from a really violent father. Not that I'm making excuses for him, but it's interesting to see how it progresses and kind of its influence on the population of Derry with people that already have an inclination towards violence. So after Eddie's arm is broken, they end up uniting together, and Ben tells them about the ritual of Chud. It's kind of a metaphysical tongue-biting giggle game that he read about in the library based off of an indigenous ceremony. And they end up kind of doing the smoke ceremony in their clubhouse. Richie and Mike kind of outlast everyone and end up hallucinating and discovering what it actually is. Then they decide to climb down into the sewers together, solely with matches and 2 silver ball bearings that they tediously crafted. And mind you, it's hundreds of miles of tunnels. It's unfathomable, actually. They don't even have a water bottle between them. Like, they are not prepared. I can't even imagine going to the grocery store without a water bottle and like a first aid kit. Ballsy. Like, children are ballsy. It's kind of horrifying. Just alone. Just to go into the sewers. Anyway, so they face it and almost defeat him. Or her, I guess. It turns out that it's a big spider monster that's a female that's pregnant, but later on. But they at least wounded it enough to send it back into hibernation. And they end up making a solemn promise to return if it comes back. They actually cut their hands with a bottle and hold hands and make this promise. It's magic. Like, there's a lot of subtle magic in this that I think is really powerful. So they're in the sewer with millions of miles, and there's a questionable sex scene between children, but I was reading about Stephen King's perspective on it, and this part was actually super intriguing, and he actually meant that to be a transition into childhood, into adulthood, about love, and that kind of closeness to bring them back together so that they could find their way out. And like, it was part of the magic. Stephen King even mentioned that that would never fly now. And I found that really interesting that he brought that up. But it was actually really beautiful to read about it. And once I understood his perspective on it, back into it. So questionable sex scene. They kind of disperse after, and they slowly forget about everything. And 27 years later, they each receive a call from Mike after he finds Georgie's missing photo at a murder scene. And the call kind of brings back some of the memories. Not all. It takes time for them to get all their memories back of Derry, Maine. But Stan actually ends up committing suicide in the bathtub after getting his call. Yeah, it was really sad. Stan was a really good character, but it kind of emphasizes how horrific those events were and those memories that surrounded it. I think Stan had the hardest time of it. So they return and start venturing around the town to retrieve their faded memories, all to be able to face it again. With Mike in the hospital, he ends up being attacked by an adult, Henry Bowers, that had escaped from the hospital, from the asylum, by the help of Pennywise and a dead Patrick. A little bit more on that. Henry was actually convicted of all of the murders. Its influence actually made Henry kill his father with a knife. And when the police came, they pinned the children's murders and disappearances on Henry. So the Losers Club kind of, thank God they were okay. But Henry definitely succumbed to the influence of it at that point. But he ended up stabbing Mike. Mike's in the hospital. And they head back down with the 2 ball bearings and a slingshot and some matches. And they remember how to face it through the ritual Chud, in which Richie actually ends up saving Bill, and they destroy it together. Eddie unfortunately dies, and they climb out after a storm destroys downtown Derry, exposing the sewer underneath. And they kind of climb out, and they gradually start forgetting. Beverly ends up with Ben, and Bill has Audra slowly start to remember after a ride on Silver. And Richie returns to California and might contemplate leaving Derry for good and moving on, as the journal he used to keep track of the events starts to fade. It's really incredible. A little bit, I'm going to kind of jump into the characters and their profiles. So I'm going to go over the characters and brief profiles on them, just because it really does help clarify their dynamics and perspective. So the Losers Club, as children, their ages range from 10 to 12, and as adults, when they come back to Derry, it ranges from 37 to 39. So the first one is Bill Dunbroe. He would be the leader of the Losers Club. He's really strong. He's really courageous. You know, he's a good leader. Like, he would never ask anything of them that he himself wouldn't do. In fact, he never actually asks for anything from the Losers Club, but they trust him, they love him. He makes a really good leader. He suffers from an extreme stutter. He actually kind of has a quote his mother taught him to help him with the stutter that he uses to battle it. He has red hair, And as an adult, he's actually balding, which is cool because he's kind of self-conscious about it when he first comes back and meets him. Like, this is the inner dialogue of the leader that everybody looks up to. So it's really cool to hear his perspective and him coping with how to face this, and the courage and the strength he draws from the members of the Losers Club. His little brother, Georgie, was murdered by Pennywise. And so his parents kind of become aloof and despondent after his little brother's death. And Bill blames himself. And he kind of grows up to become a successful author, and he lives in England and marries a movie actress, Audra, who actually resembles Beverly. And he kind of sees Pennywise as Georgie's ghost. It's interesting. It's his way of overcoming his guilt for Georgie's death. The other one is Ben Hanscom, Aka Haystack, after the wrestler. He was kind of made fun of for his weight, but he was absolutely brilliant. He was so smart, so ingenuitive, and he was a new kid in school, and his father had died in the Korean War. Henry ends up carving his name into his stomach, and before he meets the Losers Club, it's kind of how they came together. He has a crush on Beverly, and he writes her this anonymous poem. He later on becomes a really successful architect living in Nebraska. And he sees a Pennywise as a mummy after the old movie. Beverly Marsh, she was awesome. She was the only female in the group. She was fierce. She was so fierce. She was really brave. And she had red hair, similar to Bill. Kind of came from the poorest part of town. Her father was a custodian at the home hospital, and incredibly abusive. There was a lot of undertones of sexual abuse. It was alluded to in the book. Awful. She later becomes a successful fashion designer in Chicago and marries her abuser that kind of resembles her father in a lot of ways. He ends up dying later in the sewer after seeing it in its truest form. She kind of sees Pennywise as the blood, the profound amounts of blood, and her father. Richie Tozier, yeah, aka Trash Mouth, the loud, brave one. He wears glasses. He probably would have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD now, but he has all the wisecracks and insults that get him into a lot of trouble. And he also does voices, but as a child, they never quite, they always sound like himself, you know? But it's intriguing to see how he builds his life as a disc jockey later on based off of them. And his voices, he has an Irish cut voice, and that he actually uses that to face Pennywise too. But it gets him in a lot of trouble. And it also ends up ultimately saving Bill and the Losers Club and Derry as a whole. Interesting enough, I feel like because of Richie, they were actually able to defeat it. And I'm not saying that, you know, it like a lot of people think that it was Bill, but it was actually the whole club together. They came together and defeated it. I think that was the purpose of the story, is that it's showing that love and friendship and coming together. Richie, he becomes a successful disc jockey in LA, California, and he sees Pennywise as a werewolf. It's kind of funny, actually, like his jokes end up saving him from Pennywise a lot of times. Like at some point they're in the basement of the house on Newbold Street and he blows sneeze powder in its face and it ends up being detrimental, but showing that it could actually be hurt. And there was also Ely Wick. He's kind of timid, a hypochondriac. He has asthma. He carries around an inhaler. He has a very overbearing mother whom he actually ends up essentially later marrying. He marries Myra, and that's a embodiment of his mother. He was actually led to believe he had asthma until the local pharmacist tells him the truth. He just sat him down. He was really honest with him. He was possibly gay. There were undertones of it between relating with Adrian Mellen and the asthma, Pennywise and how he envisions a hobo. But with his overbearing mother, I think it just repressed a lot. So there's a lot of undertones of that. It was really intriguing, actually, to see that play out. He actually, so his mother, he lost his father at the age of 3 to cancer. The book only touches on it a little bit, but it kind of explains his mother's overbearing personality. I don't think it's malicious, but I think her anxieties and fears of losing him or being alone are kind of amplified, and kind of his actual needs are pushed to the wayside from her anxiety. And she was a good example of why its influence became a big part of it. He sees Pennywise as a diseased hobo that continuously offers him a blowjob for a dime. Really interesting. I really love it. There were a lot of those in the book. I'm looking at it now. There's a lot of margin notes, and I realize I really get fixated on anything with sexual undertones, like abuse, or this character's perspective on it. I find it really intriguing to see how the author captured that character's perspective and working through it. He might have loved Richie. I think he loved the whole group in full. And I found that actually really beautiful. I think people kind of need to get out of that realm of like sexuality, but also understand, the adolescent's understanding of sexuality and love, and finding out that they should correlate, but they're still children. They don't really understand what it means. Like, puberty is a weird age. It's a weird age. There's a lot to learn in puberty, and fuck, I hope I never have to go through puberty again. No, awful. All these hormones, it's a mess. So, Stan Uris, he's very logical, very, very clean cut. He's a Boy Scout. He's Jewish. He loves bird watching. He's also the least willing to accept the truth about Pennywise. It's very interesting how that works, because it kind of, Pennywise goes against everything that's logical, right? He's about imagination. It's part of why he feeds off of children. But it was definitely hardest on Stan. He becomes a successful accountant in Atlanta, Georgia, after leaving Derry. And it was hinted that he did have some memory left, because of after getting the call from Mike and the scene with the bathtub. And it also shows that he was the most fearful of it. He sees Pennywise as the dead children from the sandpipe. I didn't cover that. The sandpipe was something that was closed down. It was kind of like a water tower, but water reservoir. And it was enclosed, and they had stairways walking up to it. And there was a story about children that were looking down. You used to be able to walk over the reservoir, and children drowned in the reservoir. So he continuously sees it as those dead children, which makes sense because that would be completely illogical for Stan. It would be something unfathomable and terrifying. Mike Henlin, he was the lighthouse. You know, he kept the journal throughout it. He did all this research. He was the only child of color in Derry, and his father was in the military, and his father owned the farm down the road from the Bowers farm, and he had it the worst with Henry out of all of them. It actually showed a lot of it came from his father, and a lot of it was about racism. They never covered any of that in the movies. There was so much they missed out in the movies. But at some point, Henry Bowers actually poisoned his dog, Mr. Chips. Dude, that fucking little bugger, he befriended the dog first to get the dog to trust him. And then he poisoned him. Awful. Again, like, when doing the advisory warning, I had to look back and to see what subjects I had to mention. There was a lot of animal cruelty in this book. But I feel like the worst atrocities end up making the most impact of a point. Like, Henry Bowers was a sociopath. I'm not making excuses for him by any means, but what he did was fucking atrocious. And you could see that build up throughout the story. It was really intriguing to see his character development throughout. He's the only one to stay in Derry, and he becomes the head librarian and historian. His father was Wilhelm, who later dies of cancer, but he teaches Mike about Derry history. He sends him to different locations, and kind of tells him stories about each location, but he wants him to experience it on his own. He really wants him to learn it and appreciate it. His dad was really cool. His dad was awesome. He was really trying his best to pass on that kind of strength and courage and knowledge to Mike. He sees Pennywise as a gigantic bird. His father actually saw Pennywise before as a gigantic bird. So it's interesting to see how that relates. The main, I will make speech mishaps regularly, and I'm so sorry. Pennywise, it's aka Robert Gray. Totally excited because it's kind of like a dream catcher working. Very excited. It's like seeing an old friend. You're like, hey, Robert Gray, I see you. I see what you did, Stephen King. So he's this ancient monster. So he's an ancient monster, shape-shifting monster that appears to its victims as whatever they fear the most. Though at most times he kind of presents himself as Pennywise too, but that's what you regularly see him as. It cycles, kind of hibernating, becoming active every 27 years. It's very similar to a cicada or different types of insects. It claims to be eternal, the eater of worlds, but through Bill's beliefs, it proves otherwise. Because Bill so strongly believed that he could kill it, that was part of the magic, right? At some point, Bill even tried to get his father's gun until they decided on the ball bearings. And I found that interesting. The slingshot ended up proving to be the weapon of choice. But coming back to Pennywise, it came from outer space. They kind of allude to a good turtle throughout. And it's kind of a life's balance. Like the turtle represents good and happiness. And then it kind of represents fear and anger and violence. And the turtle actually contributes the help to the Losers Club in defeating it. Like you'll hear a lot about the turtle occasionally. So the secondary antagonist was Henry Bowers, kind of the town bully, enemy to the Losers Club, and becomes increasingly violent throughout the story as his sanity deteriorates. His father was incredibly violent, racist, constantly blames others for his misdoings or misfortunes. His mother left really early on. Henry was only little. So Henry eventually kills his father before going down to the sewers to kill the Losers Club. After being prompted by it in the disguise of the moon. He ends up being blamed for the slews of murders in 1957 to 58, and he ends up in an insane asylum. He normally sees Pennywise as the moon. It's interesting. They kind of convey these secondary antagonists as having the derry disease, where its influence kind of seeps into their intentions. Like they already have cracks on the surface, and it kind of seeps into that and makes them increasingly violent. Stephen King did a good job in conveying that. Victor Krus is one of those three bullies that's rivaled the Loser Club. Same as Belch Huggins. Patrick Hockstetter. He would be the epitome of a sociopath and psychopath. Same with Henry Bowers. He keeps kind of a box full of flies and gets handy with female students, quiet, but deeply disturbed. He's describing as being pallid and moon-faced. He keeps a refrigerator in the dump where he slowly kills local animals that he finds. He killed his baby brother too. So it's interesting to see, like, there's additions in the story that kind of amplify this, and it's brought up in that moment of that penis moment in the dump when Beverly finds him as she hides in the cars. It's interesting because they went on a diatribe over how with Patrick, the only reason why he was kind of left unchecked for so long because of what his mental problems actually were, was because he was quiet. He was quiet and he kept to the rules. And it was interesting. I'm going to go over more of him later on in the psychological analysis, if you will. Peter Gordon is kind of a minor character. He hangs out with Henry Bowers at the beginning, but after the rock fight, he was replaced by Patrick. There's also Steve Moose Sadler. He was another minor character. He hangs out with Bowers. He was borderline mentally handicapped. He was part of the rock fight. And his father actually works on the Henlin farm. Eddie Corcoran was a minor character. I wanted to go over him because he was interesting. He was a victim of Pennywise, and his younger brother was killed by his stepfather, Richard Macklin, who later goes to prison after Eddie's disappearance, brings up new evidence with a hammer. So Eddie's stepfather actually killed his younger brother. And I found that relevant because I'm glad that he was caught. Awful. That was probably the one example where Derry didn't necessarily turn their head like they have everything else. Like, for how far Henry Bowers got, there was probably someone that should have said something. Also, Adrian Mellen. He's another minor character that they go over earlier on in the book. Young asthmatic, gay man, falls victim to hate crime and gets killed by it. And his partner, Donna Harrigan, kind of witnessed everything. It was awful. It was over a town hat that they won at a carnival, and these bigots decide to murder him over it. It was interesting. There was, again, reading these books with that's written at a different time offers a lot of insight. It's kind of like traveling into a new country and understanding what their culture is like. And northern Maine, I found this interesting, awful, but insightful because, you know, of my perspective as a female in 2021 is very different. I would not have survived in the 50s as myself. Dick Henlin was another minor character that I thought was worth bringing up because he actually saves Mike's father from the fire at the Black Spot. Another horrific tragedy in Derry over influence. Horrific. But he was also the head cook at the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. What? Hello, old friend. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for having a long life that has carried across numerous books. I really liked Dick Henlin. So I want to go more over important events and tearjerkers and kind of special moments that I felt was worth mentioning. There was a name carving on Ben from Henry Bowers, and this was right around when Victor and Belch start questioning Henry motives. That's why I wanted to bring them up, because you can see them start questioning Henry's motives, right? And later on, the only reason why they followed Henry was because of its influence. They were almost kind of not possessed, but influenced to follow through with things that they probably wouldn't have. There was also the rock fight that brought them together with Mike, and it really does bring them all together. And they do start to, this was the moment where they really start to realize that Henry Bowers really means to be violent towards them versus threatening. The dump scene after they ate a bunch of beans and with Henry Bowers' gang, and they start lighting each other's farts. Apparently it's a boy game. You see this a lot in like summer camp or boys hanging out. I don't know. But it's followed by this sexual moment between Henry and Patrick, and Henry lashing out at Patrick and then threatening to tell people about Patrick's refrigerator. And it kind of, that's the moment where Patrick realizes he might actually get caught, right? So that's the first time he feels nervous. That kind of adds to it. The sewer scene as children with Beverly after defeating it, it was really intended to bring them together again and find their way out. It was forgotten as adults. It was interesting because Beverly didn't remember it until she slept with Bill as an adult. And it was meant to be empowering for Beverly. Stephen King mentions it in an interview later on that he really did mean it from childhood to adulthood and that transition. And it would never fly now. Because again, remember that they were 10 to 12 years old. It's really interesting. After gaining insight from the author and what he intended with these different scenes, I had a really profound impact on how I viewed him and his writing style. I have an immense amount of appreciation for Stephen King. But in a really beautiful way, it was for Beverly to overcome and empower herself after everything with her father, with the people that she loved, right? There's a lot of aspects where Beverly's father, he was violent, he was a monster, and there were these undertones of his attraction to her and coping with that. That's fucking awful. You always carry that on with you. And I found that this was actually a way for her to understand what love was and marry those two. Again, like adolescence it's a strange time, you know, it's a delicate time. Like a lot of serial killers actually sadly experience weird sexual moments that gain around the time of violence, right? So it becomes something that we repeat as an adult. And I find that really interesting that Stephen King was able to capture that moment. And in a way, like Beverly, it's kind of like the turtle, where the turtle evokes good. Like Beverly was able to overcome being a monster herself through this act and her love for the others. And it was out of pure love and wanting to bring them together that it got them out of the sewers. Again, it would never pass now, but it's really beautiful to be able to read about it. Another thing worth mentioning was the Black Spot. It was a Black-owned club that was started by the community, the Army Battalion, I think it's a right word, that came together and created it. But it was burned down by a group of white supremacists after it became a popular place for locals to hang out and listen to music and socialize. They were having a really good time, and all of this happened. It was awful. The book was magnificent in describing it. You felt like you were there, and you really felt for all of these people. And Mike's father's recollection of it was really interesting, because they saw this after they lit the bar on fire and ran away on the horses. They saw it flying and following them. So again, it contributes to its influence, the dairy disease. Also, the ironworks explosion during an Easter hunt and killing hundreds, but killing over 80 children. So it was kind of like, it would reawaken, start with the murder. Georgie's death was the start of the murders, and then it ends with something horrific, absolutely devastating, and then it would go back into hibernation. The Losers Club, by approaching it, actually stopped it. They stopped a major event from happening. So these children realize that they're doing this not just for Georgie, but for all the children. Georgie ends up representing all the children of Derry, Maine. I'm going to go over a little bit about my personal favorite from this journey. I really loved Ben. I loved his journey, from the ridicule of Henry Bowers and the new kid. He was larger. He would wear sweatshirts after being called tits and ridiculed for his body type. And then facing this transition in life after losing his father when he was so young. He was smart, he was innovative, quiet, yet incredibly thoughtful. And his overall emotional struggle with coping with Beverly and Bill, and how he dealt with it. Like, he really loved Bill. He didn't let his jealousy consume him. I just really related to him in a lot of ways, and all of his struggles. He's a very overlooked character in the movies, and I really admired him and his humility. My least favorite and questionable characters and moments. Let me just say, there's really no such thing as a least favorite character in the world of books. That is a complicated discussion in itself. The dairy disease is something to talk about, how it affected people that were already susceptible to its influence, seeping into the cracks, to already have a predisposition to it. From Eddie's mother to Beverly's father, Henry Bowers, his father, his friends, Patrick Hochstetter, and the community of Derry was prone to a lot of awfulness in a capacity that was abnormal. Its ratio for the space was 10 times over what New York or Baltimore or other places could be. And this includes examples of what happened to Adrian Mellen and the Black Spot and history repeating itself. Like, it's not that it necessarily did these things, but the people, he kind of used people to do its bidding. And it's interesting. It was kind of, there was a moment of contemplating the natural order of things, like life's duality, you know? And I found that really intriguing. I would like to talk about sociopaths and psychopaths for a minute. I'm going to go over a little bit of a psychological perspective. I'm going to pull out my DSM-4. It's a little bit out of date, yes, but insightful. And I regularly confuse the two. And I always have. I always mean to research it, but this actually brought this up to a point where I could thoroughly look into it more and explore it. And I'd love to share that with you, because I know I had a moment and this book left me with a lot of questions. So a sociopath is a personality disorder. It manifests itself in extreme antisocial attitudes and behaviors with a total lack of conscience. They don't understand others' feelings. They tend to break the rules a lot or make impulsive decisions without feeling guilt or remorse. They tend to be very manipulative and can be perceived as charismatic and charming. So they can pass really easily until someone starts to see it. But it's scary. You see that in a lot of relationships or abuse or, victims. And it's scary how much they can put forth as a front and not realize the behind scenes. So they tend to surprise people. A psychopath is defined as a mental antisocial disorder in which the individual manifests amoral and antisocial behavior. They tend to lack the ability to love or establish meaningful personal relationships and express extreme egocentricity. I can't pronounce that. I'm so sorry. But they have enormous egos normally and demonstrate a failure to learn from experience and other behaviors associated. Both are interchangeable. This is what I understand. They're interchangeable. But they're mainly distinguished by the severity of their symptoms. So a sociopath may only make minor transgressions that don't cause serious harm or distress. But a psychopath may be described to someone as physically violent or puts others in danger. Factor that in with neglect and abuse, and you have yourself just a hot mess of a dangerous human. Just awfulness. Nope. Both Henry and Patrick display these tendencies. But Henry came from a violent household and Patrick came from a relatively normal family. And I found this interesting. Like, we already know Henry Bowers was a bugger. He was just a bugger. You know what I mean? But there's that moment of understanding his father, his background. He just didn't really have a chance. You know what I mean? He never had an example of love in his life or a supportive household. But Patrick Hochstetter, his friend, might I add, neither were charming whatsoever. Neither of them. They were awful. In the books, they really conveyed a whole different matter. But it was mentioned that he also suffered from solipsism disorder. I'm so sorry if I didn't pronounce that correct. Solipsism. And it's a disorder where there is no reality beyond his own mind. So he's the only one that he perceives as real. Everybody else are essentially figments of his imagination. He was deeply disturbed. And it was made more intriguing that the only time that Patrick felt emotions was when he killed his baby brother. And in the book, it explains that transition from his baby brother to the refrigerator in the dump. I don't want to go into detail about it. It was horrific. The book explained it really beautifully. I would say pick up the book if you're intrigued in learning more. But the book explained that when he first did that was the first time he actually felt emotion. And I never really understood that, right? Especially being an empath, I feel emotions every day and other people's emotions. So sociopaths or psychopaths have always been really interesting to me because they're almost the opposite end of the spectrum, where they feel nothing and no remorse or guilt. So for them to feel an iota of something, I think would be absolutely profound. Just like for an empath to feel nothing is profound in itself. You're like, oh, I'm done now. You know what I mean? Like that's, yeah. Examples of this would be he would show his mother of scribbles he would do in school. Art normally conveys emotional development. It's a profound tool in child psychology to learn about where that child's thought process is. He also keeps dead flies in the pencil case, and this was kind of the lead up towards the animals, between his little brother and the animals. And also the murder of his little brother and his reaction in the aftermath was intriguing because he just felt nothing. He wasn't involved. He felt no guilt. It was super intriguing. And also that followed up with the incidents in school with touching girls, etc. Overall, I'm still curious about looking into it further. It's so fascinating, awful, but intriguing in the way of hoping to gain insight to other people's lives that might struggle with this. We're going to talk a little bit about sexual abuse. Yeah, it's fucking awful. Awful. Monstrous. Oh, I'm not going to get much into it because, again, we only have so much time on this podcast, and I'm not here to make it all about this. But that being said, Beverly's father displays the characteristics of male violence to substitute his sexual desire for his daughter, turning violence for his own guilt. And it's horrendous. It's really monstrous. Men freak me out. I will quote The Handmaid's Tale in this, in that men are afraid of being rejected by women, but women are afraid of men killing them. Her father seems to be struggling with a violence that's almost a lashing out from his history of trauma, and his desire for her, and him struggling maybe with that guilt, coping with it, and I think by repressing that, it manifests as violence. It's very difficult. Mind you, I am a female, and I have a history of trauma, and this one was particularly very hard for me, but insightful in a way. To read it play out for a character is a really beautiful way to reflect on your own experience and how to cope. I simply, with my intention for this part, I just want to open up a dialogue. Like, what is a monster really? Are we the monsters? Are we doomed to repeat our trauma by projecting it onto others? How do we overcome the cycle of generational trauma? Oh man, so many questions. This is one of my favorite parts about reading a really good book, is learning from them, learning a whole new perspective. My friend, actually, we were talking about one day, and something, okay, so with tattooing, you have 3 or 4 hours with this other human being. You have 3 or 4 hours to really talk to people and get to know them and really understand what makes them who they are. And one day I was reading this list of profound sadnesses, and one of them was that we will never truly know another human. Even with 3 hours, we can get a glimpse into what makes them beautiful. But how many times does someone have that chance to really sit down and have coffee and talk to someone? I wish we had more of that. I really do. And I feel like books, uniquely, you're spending this time with these characters. You're really getting to know them on a deeper level, sometimes more than other people. You know what I mean? That you know in person. And I find that really incredible. So I'm kind of going to wrap it up a little bit. Almost. I have some memorable quotes I'd like to share with you. We lie best when we lie to ourselves, by Stephen King. The Turtle Couldn't Help Us, by Pennywise during the ritual of Chud. Bill's Stutter, his poem was, he thrust his fist against the post and still insists he sees the ghost. And it was kind of his quote to empower himself. He really wanted to be able to successfully be able to say that, to prove his worth to his family, to kind of gain their love after his little brother's death. And the poem that Ben wrote to Beverly anonymously was, your hair is winter fire, January embers, my heart burns there too. I just thought it was beautiful. This little 10-year-old wrote this little poem that's a really profound little poem for a little boy. And at some point, Audra says, book value. And I just love that. That's going to be forever my truth. When you feel stressed, to sit down with a good book and remember that everything's going to be okay. I think that's awesome. I'm going to go over a little bit about the author and how relating to this book. I love Stephen King. I am totally, completely biased, and I will forever blame Scary Stories and Goosebumps when I was little. And some people might claim his books, like his novels, his actual novels, to be a bit of a tome, like lengthy and overly descriptive. But I personally really love that. I love his ability to be able to have a novel, but also his gift with short stories. But his longer novels, I love that one can savor his universe, to fall in love with it so completely. I love savoring. It's kind of like a really good piece of dark chocolate. It's not everybody's cup of coffee, but when you can enjoy it, it's incredible. And you just live in that moment. I think the world is so fast, it's so quick. That's the other reason for the podcast, is that I want a time for you to be able to sit down and be calm and be happy and just share this book with me. Because I feel like so often we don't get a chance to savor something. This is kind of my way to savor this book, just that last little crumb of a piece of really good chocolate. This podcast is kind of that moment for me with this book. It's about my relationship with this book and how much I learned from it and how much I want to share that with you. I also love Stephen King's ability to relate with the child perspective and relating it to adults, and his overarching theme in his work. From Carrie to The Shining, The Long Walk, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, The Institute. He's phenomenal with it. He's so gifted. And I also love his ability to write about relating writing to art and artists alike. He's been a huge inspiration to me. So much so I actually have a tattoo of him smiling on my leg. I love him that much. Like, if I'm feeling down or I am having a moment where I'm having like artist block, I'll actually watch his interviews and I'll relate how his writing method relates to drawing time or creating, painting, etc. And he really captures fear in a situation in its simplest form. It's so impressive. There were actually, so with the movie, so they had 3 of them. The original movie, kind of condensed into a mini-series, was 1990, followed up by 2017, and then Chapter 2 in 2019. It could never touch the book. Movies can never touch the book, but I love watching movies after finishing the book. Just, again, it's like that crumb of a delicious piece of dark chocolate or a really good cup of coffee in that last sip. Like, you can just inhale it, right? Or you can savor the shit out of it. And this is my way of savoring, is to watch the movies. But I will say they did really well with it. They brushed over a lot of the more sensitive material. But I think that's to be expected for a movie format. There's a lot of touchy subjects that hit on, and they would face a lot of tremendous lashback. And I think books are also protected in a way movies are not. And I'm so grateful for that. I feel like books are always unfiltered, super raw. And it makes sense too, because someone has to find it, right? They have to read the back jacket. You know, they have to be invested to read it. I'm so glad that books are protected. Oh, man. And it also, like, I can imagine I see a lot of children dressing up as it for Halloween. And I can understand that they also don't want to alienate their audience or have children not be able to be allowed to see it because of certain content. So maybe the movie is kind of a way to introduce people to the book. Like, if they love the movie, they would definitely love the book. And I will admit, every time I do see a movie, I will always research. If I loved it, I'll research and see if it was a book. And then I'll wait like a couple of months and then I'll get the book to read it and like just love the shit out of it. So funny. The 90s version kind of hit more on the severity of the violence and the truth of it versus 2019. I could not get over that they made Patrick into the slender, Hot Topic looking version of Patrick Hockstetter. I'm like, that was not... What are you guys doing? What are are you doing right now of idolizing sociopath and psychopath? Maybe in a weird way, they were trying to evict the charming aspect of what it means to be a sociopath. I don't know. I'd be super intrigued to talk to more people about the psychological perspective of like movies relating to books and their interpretation of it. Some inspiration to leave on, that everybody, children to adults, to parents, to their children, to that weird, obscure aunt that lives in the woods in a cabin on the mountain, deal with deep-rooted fear and shame and guilt and secrets, and that there's no difference between the two. There's no difference between someone whose 70s fears are from a 3-year-old's fear of the dark. They are all completely valid, and they live inside all of us. And it's interesting how we can learn to overcome it. And versus before becoming the fear itself, right? And repeating it. Some book recommendations, books to follow up with. Carrie by Stephen King, The Long Walk. It's really good. Lord of the Flies. What? Battle Royale. So good. Japanese Hunger Games. Will forever love Battle Royale. But there's like overarching themes of children in a position to make impossible decisions under extraordinary circumstances. And there's so much to learn from that moment or that psychotic break where someone can be going through something and what is their breaking point, especially for children that don't have that much life experience, right? So their breaking point, it's weirdly very similar to adults, actually. It's like adults kind of learn a little bit to let go, but I think children are kind of like this really raw form of that, like what adults really want to do. I think children do a good job with that. Another one that I'd probably recommend is Duma Key, if you have a morbid love for the mutilation of Georgie's arm and aftermath of horrific life events, intertwined with a bit of weirdness. A little weird. There's funny moments. Don't get me wrong. Stephen King's It has funny moments combined with horror, and that's hard to do. That's extremely hard to do, and I love it. That's probably my favorite. I will forever be a fan of 80s horror movies for that very reason. Give me a little bit of humor in my absolute devastating horror that will give me nightmares, but make me laugh a little bit when I wake up, and then be just confused. Just be confused in life. Yeah, so let's ask some questions. I still have questions after all of this. After oh man, all the research, all this writing, it's so interesting. So where the fuck was Beverly's mom? Where was she? What did she do? I do not blame her. Domestic abuse is fucking awful, and this is just me asking, it's easy for me to say, I don't have children, I'm not married, I'm not in 1957, but why didn't she stop it? I understand it was a very different time, and she shouldn't be blamed, but fuck, leave him, and take Beverly away from this monster. I feel like she was a victim of fear. And like, if anybody is listening and anybody finds themselves in an abusive relationship with someone like a sociopath or psychopath that presents really charming to someone's face and then hurts you in any kind of way after, or hurts your children, fucking leave them. You know what I mean? Fucking leave. Worst. And I know it's hard. I know it's awful. But maybe this can be your inspiration towards finding your happiness and a really beautiful life. You do not need that. That's my little moment. I'm getting all teary-eyed. I love you. Yeah. That's my moment. That's all I'm gonna say. Other question. Why didn't Patrick Hocksutter's father follow through after realizing Patrick might have killed his baby brother? I get it. Ignore it. You know? But, like, that should have given, he was seriously disturbed. Like, thank God for advances in medical, and mental health now. But, have your child evaluated. People are very aware now. They're doing really good with finding help for people like that. And I think a lot of Henry Bowers or Patrick Hockstetter now would have, a psychologist would have diagnosed them, the school system would have recognized it, and they could have possibly gotten help. Not only to prevent everything that happened, but also turn their lives around and also be, you know, even a member of society and help other people. You know, I don't know. Again, this book introduced a lot about psychopaths and sociopaths that I really didn't understand before. But I thought that was interesting. Also, at that point, was there really help for people with mental illness? Did it depend on the severity? If they were violent, did they just go to a hospital? Was it best to ignore it versus seeking help? Yeah, I mean, it could be a generational subject. That's why I love books so much, is that I could step into the 50s for a minute and it would have been awful, but super humbling. You know, there's so many more people that are struggling with these ideas now, even though it might be much more progressive now. I think diving into books like these really offer the courage and strength to people to work through them. Some food for thought. It took 4 years for Stephen King to write it. This was super humbling. From 1981 to 1985. And I was very happy about that. Thank you so much for persevering through 4 years of labor for this beautiful work of art that I was able to read and enjoy and savor and love so completely. Especially now, like, people think that artists can just draw something up in 5 minutes. You know, it's such a moment, but that's not how it works. Like, for tattooing, at least, some of these drawings can take hours, even days to complete and research and understand and create something beautiful and pour your love and spoons into. And I think it's important to give that credit to that artist or that author, to understand the finished product better. You know, there's a lot of failures behind really beautiful artwork, and I think it's important to give credit to that. Interesting. So I was curious if it was banned at all. Apparently banned books. So specific districts can choose to ban books from the school libraries. And I found that really interesting. I'm going to look more into it as I do these episodes, because banned books freak me out. I feel like there's so much to learn from them, and I know they have sensitive material in them, but I feel like children need more credit. You know, I feel like children are very curious, and books are a source of knowledge. Like, I want to this is kind of meant to dive into reading again. This is meant to create something based off of books we love. And there's so much I learn from each book, even if I read it as a child, if I read it as an adult. And I read when I was that age, like 10 or 11. I didn't pick up on those scenes. I didn't pick up on the deaths or the animal cruelty like I did as an adult. And I find that really intriguing. I don't know. Maybe someone can give me perspective as a parent with their children, and maybe it's being what to be exposed to. But I feel like if a child is reading a really good book, it should be left uncensored. Like, books shouldn't be censored because there is so much of an investment of time that it should be raw. You know what I mean? Just like this podcast, like, I was struggling with the idea of if I should censor it or not. And I don't think it should. I think people actually really need that. There's a lot of censoring, and I don't want to do that to people. I want to thank you so much for going on this journey with me today with this beautiful book. I'm so grateful and honored to be able to share this experience with you. And I so hope that it inspired you to ask questions, maybe pick it up again, or even put it in your Amazon cart. I love when you finish a really good book and you're left with a void. I know that sounds awful, but in a way, it's like learning to love again after having your heart broken and ripped to shreds. And I do believe this might be the final stage of grief for me with these episodes. Acceptance and provide closure and to grieve with loved ones. Your book family. You. And I'm so incredibly grateful. And I want you to know that. I so hope you have a beautiful day today and that you enjoy a really good cup of coffee. Maybe a few laughs with friends and a special moment or two. I'm sending all my love and good intentions through sound waves. And I thank you so much for this really good conversation about a beautiful book. And if you have any questions or would like to offer a book recommendation based off of this book, please feel free to message me. I'll provide some links below. There's a little link where it says support the show, but it actually leads to the information of the show and a way to message me and things like that. So you can reach out if you hear this and you want to share your thoughts. I think that would be really awesome. Thank you so much. I hope you have a really good day. And I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.